So it's the next problem in that section. This is actual data. And we're starting to see, there's so many inequities that exist out there, racial inequities. And, you know, the African-American black population, they are treated still to this date inequitably. If you look at so many different variables, incarceration rates, traffic stops, death penalty, and even we're seeing it in the coronavirus, that the black population is suffering to a much larger degree than the white population, particularly down in Detroit. Blacks make up 13% of the general population. It's probably a little higher than that, 17% maybe down in Detroit. But 40% of all the COVID-19 deaths were blacks. And so this is just another example of inequities, racial inequities that exist out there in our world. So do you support the death penalty for first-degree murder? You don't have to answer that, but this might be this example might be an indication that might change your mind, and maybe not. But this is from Florida murder trials in this period. Florida was a state that had the death penalty and used it frequently for a long, long time. I don't think they've put anyone to death over the last several years, so it's kind of on it stopped. It stopped over the time, over the years, probably because some of the inequities that we're observing in the data. Is there a relationship between the race of the defendant? Okay, so someone is accused of murder, and what happens is that the prosecutor will get all the information and decide whether or not to indict. And they take their case to the judge, and the judge says, yes, we'll bound this over for trial, or we won't. And that first decision, a lot of times, there's a lot of inequities in that first decision between blacks and whites, blacks and non-white black defendants. But this one has to do with actually who received the death penalty. That is a defendant of a particular race more likely to receive the death penalty than a defendant of a different race? Blacks versus white, in other words. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're going to identify the independent variable. So up here is the race. We want to see if there's a difference between the two groups here. Now, if you want to think about how ethnicity played a role here, for Hispanics, this particular data was not broken down. So we have white Hispanics and we have black Hispanics, and they were just grouped together, either white or black. The dependent variable is over here. Did defendant receive the death penalty? And the answers are yes or no. Okay, so to analyze this, the first thing we're going to do is just go ahead and notice that race is the independent variable. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide each of these responses by the total. So for the whites, the percent, we could say the percentage of whites that were given the death penalty. If we wanted to know that percentage, we would divide the 53 by the 483. Same thing down here. Whereas with the blacks, we do it the same way, only there are fewer blacks. There are many more whites in our country than blacks, and even in Florida. And so these we're going to divide by 15 out of the 191. And you can see here that you have 1, 2, 3, 4 proportions. So this test, and the reason it comes now in the course is because now we're bumping up from 2 proportions up to multiple proportions. And here we see 4 of them. All right, I'm going to give you these numbers. Just punch them into your calculator. This one is about, I'm going to round these to 3 decimal places. 89% of whites did not receive the death penalty, but 11% did. And for the blacks, we have this. 92% of black defendants were not given the penalty, death penalty. Only about 8% were given the death penalty. So when you look at all 674 capital murder cases, we have, it looks like, if we just compare the yeses, that 11% of the whites are sentenced to death, whereas only 7.9% of the blacks are sentenced to death. So by looking at these two numbers, it appears that that there is no inequity. It appears that blacks are not sentenced to death at a greater rate than whites. So if somebody was an advocate for the death penalty, and someone came to them and said, you know, hey, we can't have the death penalty. It treats blacks differently than whites. Blacks are put to death at a higher rate than whites. This data can be shown to show you that no, in fact, that's not the case. All right, now these numbers here are called conditional proportions. And these are the numbers that we calculate in a contingency table like this to decide if there's a difference. So for example, we would say there's about a 8%, 11%, there's about a 3% difference in whether someone receives the death penalty or not. While I'm here, I'm going to calculate and divide each of these row totals and column totals and row totals by the total number of cases, capital murder cases. And I'll also give you that number. Well, I'll just go ahead and calculate them. Yeah, so there they are, 0.717, 0.283, 0.101, and 0.899. So these are, these here are called marginal proportions. In section 4.4, you're pretty much going to be asked to calculate the marginal proportions and the conditional proportions. And then we take a problem like this and move it into chapter 12 to see if the observed differences are statistically significant. We did problems like this back in chapter 5. I don't know if you remember, but we would say something like, what is the probability if a randomly selected capital murder case was selected at random? What is the probability that the defendant would be white? And then we would take the total white over the total of capital murder cases and say, oh, the probability is 0.717. So proportions and probabilities in this context are the same. This one here, VS, it looks like about 10.1% of all the capital murder cases. In those cases, the defendant was sentenced to death. So you can see even in Florida that juries are very unlikely to sentence somebody to death. Only 10% of the capital murder cases did that happen. Okay, now here's the interesting part about this data. If we go down here and we break down this table into two other tables, and we're going to break it down by who was killed. When there is a murder, someone was killed. Sometimes it's a white person, sometimes it's a black person. And so you can see of those 674, 515 times a white person was murdered, and 159 times a black person was murdered. So if you add those two numbers together, you get the 674. And you could do that for every single category. So for example, white yes, 53, white yes, 0. 53 and 0 equals the 53 there. Similarly, if you take 37 black defendants were not sentenced to death when a white person was murdered. And over here, 139 black defendants were not sentenced to death when a black person was killed. 139 and 37 adds up to the total, 176. So these two tables come from this data. We just break it down by who was killed, the race of the person killed. Now let's calculate the conditional proportions in the same way, just to see what we come up with. So again, we're going to treat the race of the defendant as the independent variable. And so we're going to divide by the column totals in each case. And we'll do it for both tables. And I'll put in here the decimals of these numbers because decimals are easier to convert to percentages. Okay, those are the percentages when we have a white victim murdered. And over here, this one's not too hard, 0.000, 1.000, 100%. And this one is 0.028, and this one is 0.972. So again, these red numbers are conditional proportions. And what it allows us to do is to compare levels of the independent variable. In this case, it allows us to compare white murderers and black murderers together. Okay, let's just look at the yeses, because the yeses mean that these people were sent to death. These defendants were sent to death. And if you compare this, black defendants were sent to death when a white person was killed 22.9% of the time. And white defendants were sent to death only 11.3% of the time when a white victim was killed. A black murderer is twice as likely, we can say, than a white murderer to be sentenced to death when a white person is murdered. So this clearly could give us some evidence to say that the death penalty is discriminatory, because twice as many black, and a higher percentage, 2 times the percentage of whites are being sentenced to death when a white person is sentenced or murdered. And then come over here. When a black person is murdered, it is never the case that a white murderer would be sentenced to death. Never. And even when a black when a black murderer kills a black person, that black murderer is only sentenced to death 2.8% of the time. So what's larger between these two numbers? The black defendants. What's larger between these two numbers? The black defendants. So when we break it down by the race of the victim, in both cases, blacks are sentenced to death at a much higher rate than whites for killing a white victim and for killing a black victim. And this might not seem intuitive to you, because up here, the opposite relationship was found. That is, whites appeared to be put to death at a higher rate than blacks up here. But when we use the same data and break it down by victims, you can see that the black defendants, the black murderers, were sentenced to death at twice the rate when a white person is murdered. And you can see how these percentages are much lower than these over here. So when white victims are murdered, the death penalty applies much more often than when a black person is killed. The death penalty is almost never. 4 times out of 159 times was someone sent to death for killing a black victim. So here are some of the inequities that we're talking about in our society. And if someone wanted to, it's the same data, right? So someone could use the same data. Someone could use the data up here in this analysis to say that there's no discrimination in the death penalty, but someone else could then break it down in this way and say, hey, wait a second, if we break it down by victim, then you clearly see that the relationship switches and blacks are much more likely to be sent to death. And so this might be one of the reasons why you often hear Black Lives Matter, because here is a situation where clearly that cannot be substantiated by the data. All right, so these conditional proportions is the very first thing we look at in a study of this kind. And so let's go ahead and, by the way, here's the marriage example. They ask you for the row and column totals. You can see that there's about an equal percentage of men and women. And if we do the marginal totals, 47.5% of this sample were men and 52.5% women. And you can see that 63.6% said of the respondents said that they were very happy in their marriage. Another third said they're pretty happy in their marriage, and only about 2.9% said they're not too happy. And I guess this makes sense, because if they're in a marriage and they're not too happy, well, then maybe they would get a divorce. And so this should not be that high of a number. When you compare the conditional proportions here, and here's the total. So if you divide each of these numbers by the men total and divide each of these numbers by the female total, then you get these percentages. You can see males respond very happy at a higher rate, 65.6% versus 61.8%. Pretty happy, it looks like females respond about 2.4 percentage points higher with that response. And here's where the big difference is. Even though it seems like 1.4% isn't a big difference, you got to look in terms of relative difference or percentage change. And it would take about 1.5 of these to equal this number. So we would say that females are 1.5 times more likely to respond not too happy than males. So for those of you that said that men are happier in their marriage, this last row here would probably give you evidence to support that. Conditional proportions, marginal proportions, and then row and column totals. So in a previous section, we looked at calculating probabilities from a two-way table like this. It's called empirical probability.